Susanna Foy had buried her husband, taken up his 160-acre claim with her own two hands, and been told by every settled soul in the county that a lone woman could not hold a homestead through a hard year. And the year the grass stood dry and the wind turned hot out of the south was the hardest that country had known. The whole sea of it cured to tinder, a wall of prairie fire working toward her shanty, her herd, and the hard-won hay meant to carry the stock through winter. The county looked at a widow alone before a coming fire and decided she would be burned out and gone by first snow, a good many not sorry to think it, for her quarter held the best hay-meadow and the only living water for 3 miles. She did not yet know that the one soul who would stand between her and the fire was the quiet man the county rode past without a nod, the man who plowed its fire breaks in the dark. It had begun the way the hard turns of a life do, with a loss she did not choose. Thomas Foy had filed the claim, broken the first sod, sunk the well, and cut the first meadow, meaning to prove it up and grow old on it beside his wife, when he drowned the autumn before, fording the swollen creek at dusk with the last of the season's supplies. He left Susanna a widow of 28 on a half-proved claim in a country with no soft place for a woman alone. By the Homestead law, she could carry her husband's entry and prove it up as his widow, and she meant to, for it was the only home she had ever called her own. But the law that let her keep the claim said nothing of the work of holding it, and that year, holding it meant standing a fire season that had strong men speaking low. And the settled side of the county, with the biggest stockman's wife at its head, looked at a widow keeping a claim alone against a fire year, and decided before troubling to help her what would come of it. Harlan Voss let it be understood at the meeting-house and the store that it was an unnatural thing, a woman alone on a quarter with no man to stand it, and that Susanna Foy would do better to sell out and go keep some other woman's house. It ran through the county low and sure, and left Susanna lonelier with every week the grass cured and the wind rose. Here is the thing the county had not troubled to learn. Susanna Foy was no helpless creature to be pitied off her land, but a spare, steady woman who had held the claim and the herd alone a whole year without asking a soul for a thing. And in those first dry weeks she had begun to notice something she could not explain, a light on the far edge of her ground in the dead of night, a lantern moving slow and low along the grass that she took for a stray rider or a trick of her tired eyes, gone by morning, but for one time a fresh line of turned black earth along her fence. But that battered tin lantern with its wire-mended handle would come in time to be the dearest thing on that whole quarter to her, though she did not yet know whose hand carried it or why. And none of it would keep the fire off her, for the wind and the dry grass cared nothing for a widow's grit. A prairie fire in a cured year moved faster than a horse could run and turned the sky the color of an old bruise, and the only defense was a fire-break, a wide belt of grass plowed under to bare earth or burned off ahead in a careful backfire, so the flame came up to it and found nothing to eat. But a lone woman with a fire coming, a herd to move and hay to save, could not wring hers alone, and every man knew it. Harlan Voss knew it best of all, for he ran the most land and stock in that country, had long wanted the Foy quarter's hay-meadow and its water, and meant to have it cheap the day the widow gave it up. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is saved by luck or a fortune out of the sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season they have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then draw your chair up close and stay with me, for Susanna is about to learn the thing this channel keeps circling back to, that the people a county is quickest to write off are so often the very ones with the most quiet worth in them, and that the soul it never thinks to thank, the one who does the thankless work in the dark, is so often the one who will stand between you and the fire when it comes. Harlan Voss did not come at Susanna with threats, but with a kindness that was worse. He rode out on his good horse, hat in hand, and told her in his slow, regretful way that it grieved him. But a fire year was no year for a woman alone, and this one would be the worst in memory. When it came through, and it would take her hay, her stock, and likely the roof over her head, and leave her a burned-off claim she could never prove up. He would spare her all of it. He would buy the quarter now, at a fair price he called it, and she could go back east with money in her hand instead of ashes. And Susanna stood on the ground her husband had broken, the hot wind pulling at her skirts, and had never so wanted somewhere else to go. The teeth in the county's talk had a name, and the name was Vester Loomis, Voss's range boss, a loud, plausible man who had got himself made a kind of fire-warden and used the office to serve his employer. He let it be understood wherever men gathered that the Foy quarter was a standing danger to every neighbor around it, that a lone woman could not keep her guards plowed nor watch her backfires, and that when the burn came and jumped from her neglected ground onto honest men's grass, the blame would be hers, and the county would do well to press her off before she fired them all out. It was a cruel and clever thing. It dressed Voss's greed as prudence and made her very aloneness the proof against her. The silent soul who would stand between her and the fire was Micah Coulter, the closest-mouthed man on that range, and the one the county was least in the habit of thanking. For 3 years it had been Micah who plowed the fire breaks that ringed the town and the road and the section lines, and rode the guards in the fire months, beating out the little starts before they grew, and the county took it all for granted, as a man takes the floor beneath his feet. He was a big, weathered man in his middle 30s, dark and short-bearded, who had come to that country alone, and lived alone at the dry end of the range, so far out of the habit of talk that folk took his silences for sourness. He had known Thomas Foy, helped him sink the well, and stood at the back of the crowd the day they buried him, and said not a word to the widow since that anyone had heard. But Micah Coulter had eyes, and what they told him, from the day the talk turned against her, was that the woman the county had written off was no burden waiting to happen, but the steadiest hand on that range. And he understood 2 things the county would not say aloud: that Voss did not care a straw whether she burned or not, but wanted only her hay-meadow and her water, and that Loomis's fire-warden talk was a built thing, got up to hang her by her own courage. And he carried a 3rd thing besides. On the day they lowered Thomas Foy into the ground, he had made himself a plain, silent promise to see the man's widow safe on that claim whatever it cost him, for he had loved her, without a word ever spoken, since long before her husband died, and had held his peace out of honor, meaning only to see her through, and then take himself off for good. If you've made it this far into Susanna's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He came to her at the end of a long, hot day in the dooryard of the claim, and took off his hat, and turned it slowly in his big hands, and said the longest thing he had said to a living soul in a year. It was not his place, he knew, but the fire was coming, and soon, and it was not right that she should stand it alone. He had a team and a breaking plow, and had cut more fire guards than any man in the county, and he would be glad, if she would let him, to wring her claim in guards deep enough to turn the worst of it, to stand the backfiring with her, and to help her move the stock when the day came. He would take no pay. It was only what a neighbor ought to do, and the county had not. He made the whole speech to the crown of his hat, and waited, braced for her to send him off. Susanna did not answer quickly. Pride is a hard thing to set down, and she had set down so much already, her husband, her people, near everything but the ground under her feet and the will to hold it, that the habit of asking nothing of anybody had grown into her like a second set of bones. But she looked at the brown haze standing up along the southern sky, thought of her herd and her hay, and the winter past them, and understood that the man before her offered no charity nor pity, only his hands and his hard-won skill as one working soul to another, and that to send him off to save her pride would be to lose the ground to save her feelings. So she told him, steady, that she would be grateful, and would work at his side and not behind him. And the corner of Micah Coulter's mouth moved, which on that man was very nearly a smile. And so the two of them set to cutting fire against the coming of the fire. They plowed the guards in the raw heat of the day, Micah driving the breaking plow, and Susanna leading the team and clearing the furrows 3 and 4 wide, a bare belt between, and 3 and 4 again, ringing the shanty, the well, the stackyard, and the meadow in bands of turned black earth the flame would find nothing to feed on. When the wind lay right in the cool of evening, they set careful backfires, burning the grass off ahead of themselves and walking the edge with wet sacking, beating down any tongue that reached the wrong way, so the great fire, when it came, would run up against ground already burned and starve. They did it side by side, day on day, black to the elbows and red-eyed with smoke, and each marked how the other never flinched, and neither said so. The hard turn of that dry season was the slow making of them. There was nowhere much to be but at the work, and a thing done shoulder to shoulder against a common danger wears down the distance between two people whether they will it or not. She found Micah was not silent for having nothing to say, but for too many years, with no one worth the saying of it to, and that if she did not press him, the words came low and dry, and once in a great while very nearly funny. She came to know the tell of his jaw when the wind shifted wrong, and he the set of her shoulders when she tired. She took to keeping a plate warm for whatever hour he came in from the far guards, and he took to leaving mended without a word, the small things a place falls short of when one pair of hands must do the work of two. And the talk between them, between two people thrown together only to stand off a fire, came slow, and then easier, the way a cold room warms once the fire is lit. He told her, a little at a time, of the years he had spent alone, and the thankless guards he had cut, and Susanna did not try to mend it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. And she found herself telling him things she had told no one, of Thomas and the creek, and the long first year of holding the claim with her heart gone out of her, and he offered no easy comfort, only listened, and once laid his rough hand a moment over hers on the plow handle and took it away again. They both felt the change and were half afraid of it, for a thing built against a fire had no business taking root and growing green. It was the lantern that opened the way through, the light she had never been able to account for. For as the guards went round her claim, she saw that the fresh lines of turned black earth she had found along her fences those first weeks before ever Micah had spoken to her were the same deep furrows she now watched him cut by day, that someone had been wringing her ground against the fire in the dead of night, weeks before she asked a soul for help. And one night she stood in her dark doorway and saw the light again at the edge of her quarter and walked out toward it. And it was Micah, driving his own team by that battered lantern hung on the plow, cutting another guard along her line after a full day cutting the counties. She understood all at once that the light she had taken for a stranger had been him all along, keeping a watch over her she had never been meant to see. The rest she had from old Asa Wingate, who kept the store on the road below her claim, and had no more patience than his wife Bess for the talk against her. She had gone in for oil, and to ask, careful, whether Micah still meant to take up the fire-warden's post in the next county that folk said was his for the asking. A steady place with steady pay, the first real chance the man had ever been offered to get out from under a range that had never thanked him. And the old storeman, not knowing he told her anything, said no. That Coulter had turned it down flat the same week Voss got the county to hand the paid fire break contract to Loomis's outfit and cut Micah out of even his grudging pay, and had gone on plowing the guards all the same, for nothing, buying his own oil to do it. A man did not turn down the one good chance of his life to do thankless work in the dark, Asa said, for no reason at all. Susanna walked back to the claim with her ears ringing, and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely lent her a neighbor's hand. He had turned down his one chance to leave a place that scorned him and spent his own money and his own sleep to wring her ground against the fire, and had done it while his own claim stood with hardly a guard around it, because he had spent every night on hers. He had meant her never to know, and to take himself quietly off once she was safe. Susanna, who had been taught too young to ask anything of anyone, felt something come loose in her chest she had shut away since she buried Thomas. That evening she carried the lantern to where he was greasing the plow, and lit it, and hung it on the nail by her own door where he could see it, and set her hand over his, and did not draw it back. And he looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. The fire came 3 days later, in the worst heat of the afternoon. It announced itself as a smudge on the horizon, then a brown smoke that blotted the sun to a dull red coin, and then they could hear it, a low freight train roar that was the sound of miles of grass burning at once. There was no time for fear. Micah had the plan long made, and they worked it. They fired the last backburn off the windward guards. They drove the bawling herd in behind the plowed belts onto the burned ground by the well. They wetted the sacking and the shanty roof, and stood their line. And then the wall of it came on, a front of flame taller than a man, throwing heat before it like an open oven door, and it reached the wide bare guards Micah had cut and cut and cut again, and it starved. It guttered and dropped and found no way through, and went around and roared off to the north, leaving Susanna's claim standing in a sea of smoking black, the shanty whole, the stock safe, the hay untouched behind its rings of turned earth. But the fire her guards turned had to go somewhere, and it went north and east across the dry end of the range and took the little unguarded claim it found there. Micah Coulter had spent every night of that season wringing her ground, and left his own with barely a furrow around it, and when the smoke lifted his shanty and his stack, and his fences were a black smear on the prairie, burned to the bare ground while he stood his line at hers. He said nothing, as was his way, and when Susanna came and put it into plain words, that he had let his own place burn to save hers, he only said low, that a man could raise a shanty again in a season, and turned his back on the ashes of his own 5 years to look instead at her claim standing whole, as if that were the thing he had saved, and the other only the price of it. Which it was. It should have ended there, but Vester Loomis was not done. With half the North Range burned and Voss's own grass among it, he stood up at the county meeting called to reckon the losses, and said the thing he had been building toward all along, that the fire had run wild off the Foy quarter, that a lone woman's neglected guards had loosed it on honest men, and that she must give up a claim she could not hold. It was a lie, and a bold one, but Susanna Foy was not the friendless creature Loomis had spread word of, and she did not mean to be driven off her husband's ground with a falsehood. She sent word up and down the county that she would answer the charge herself, before any who cared to come, and stand her claim open to any man who wished to walk it and see whose ground had held the fire and whose had loosed it. They came out onto the burned prairie the next morning to see the widow answer for the fire, with Loomis loud in his good coat and Voss on his fine horse at the back, and they walked, as she asked, the black line of the burn, and any man who could read the ground could read the truth on it, that the backfire which stopped the great burn short of the whole South Range had been set from the Foy guards, and that the flame had died against them, that the fire had not come off her ground at all, but had been turned by it, and had found its way north only where the guards ran thin, because the man who cut them had spent his nights on hers. Susanna stood on the burned edge of her whole and standing claim, the herd grazing safe behind her, and did not make a speech. She only opened her husband's dated field book, kept faithfully on after him, every guard cut, every day of residence held, and let the men who could read see the dates and understand whose care had saved them. And then old Asa Wingate, who was not a man to let a thing stay crooked, spoke up from the crowd and told plainly what he knew, that Micah Coulter had cut those guards by night, for nothing out of his own pocket, having turned down the warden's post to do it, and that his own place was the black ruin they could all see smoking on the north rise, because he had guarded the widow's ground before his own. There was no cruel word in it, only the county seeing at last what it had been too comfortable not to see before, that the woman it had written off had held her claim and turned the fire, and that the silent man it had never thought to thank had saved the half of them and lost all he owned doing it. A good many settled wives found of a sudden they had somewhere else to look, and more than one man who had believed Loomis came up and gripped Micah's hand. Harlan Voss rode back up the range with his face gone stiff, having reached for a widow's hay-meadow by way of a fire he was half glad to see, and found the ground held against him and the county watching him hold his tongue. Vester Loomis, whose fire-warden heirs did not survive the sight of the guards he had sworn were never cut, was gone from the district before first snow, and no more was heard of pressing the widow off her claim. Susanna Foy proved up her husband's quarter that autumn, whole and unburned and hers in her own right, the one green-black island of held ground in a country that had learned, the hard way, the worth of a plowed fire-break, and of the two people it had been so sure it could do without. Micah had stood at the back of it all and would have taken himself quietly off, his promise kept and the widow safe. But Susanna Foy had buried one good man for want of saying a thing in time, and did not mean to lose a second the same way. She went to him where he stood at the edge of the burned ground, and took the lantern down from its nail and put it into his hands, and told him he had cut guards enough around other people's lives in the dark, and it was time he came in where the light was. And the quiet man, who had loved her without a word since long before, and had let his whole place burn to hold her home, said the plainest thing he had ever said, that he had meant to go, and found he could not, for there was no road left in the world he wished to walk that did not have her on it. And Susanna did not make him say it twice. They were married that winter in the little meeting-house that had lowered its voice about her only a season before. Micah raised his shanty again in the spring, and then a true house on the Foy claim that was theirs together now. And the lantern that had once crossed the widow's fields in the dark and been taken for a stranger hung lit beside their own door every dusk, brought in at last from the thankless dark, and set where it belonged. A doubt, it turns out, is the smallest measure of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a county can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to stand beside you in the hard season. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the fire is coming and the whole world has already counted you lost, do you let their doubting and your own hard pride drive you off the ground you have made with your own two hands? Or do you trust the quiet, unlikely soul who shows up in the dark to cut a guard between you and the flame? Tell me which one you would choose, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.